So there were some graphs that we talked about on Breaking Points that you found interesting as well, and I do want to hear your take on them. These were posted on Twitter. The headline here is the increasing ideological differences on a variety of measures of sort of like how you feel about yourself, how you feel about the future, your levels of anxiety. Huge discrepancies opening up between liberals and conservatives. So liberals are consistently saying like they feel worse about themselves, they're not satisfied with their life seems meaningless. They disagree with the sentiment, I enjoy life as much as anyone. This one really jumped out at me, Kyle, that they were asked, the future often seems hopeless. And you had the number of liberals agreeing with that sentiment really spiking and again opening up a huge gap with conservatives. On almost all of these measures of pessimism and personal dissatisfaction, the conservative number is on the rise as well. But the liberal number has really jumped up and opened up this kind of ideological chasm and how people feel about themselves, their lives, and the future. What do you make of this?
So let me first ask you, what do you make of that? I have a lot of thoughts, but what do you make of that?
I mean, I think, first of all, I think, as Marianne says, it can be a sign of psychological health to have negative feelings when there are negative things going on. More liberal, younger Americans are more likely to self-identify as liberal. So there's likely a big generational gap here. And, for young people, unfortunately, I think it makes sense to have some level of pessimism about the future. We're living right now through this massive heat wave that's like global in nature. I think Phoenix has had 18 days in a row over 110 degrees. We had these huge floods in New England. Right now, as we speak, if we walk outside, we're under some air warning alert because of the wildfires in Canada. All of this climate crisis seems to be marching forward unabated. So there's that piece when you ask, like, hey, how do you feel about the future? That seems pretty grim. And then there's also the, material conditions of Gen Z and millennials who are struggling to be able to ever even imagine affording a house, being able to have a family, being able to have kids. Every milestone they're behind where older generations are. So if you have this generational divide, you can imagine boomers feeling like, yeah, it's pretty good. Like, I'm pretty stable. I got a little nest egg. My investments did well. I've got a house. Like, things feel pretty good to me. Whereas if you're younger, and younger people, again, more likely to be liberal, you could see how your outlook would be a little more negative.
So I'm in an interesting place looking at these numbers because I'm somebody who's politically on the left, but I actually have very conservative qualities.
Yeah, you do.
So I consider myself very personally happy. I think I'm pretty orderly and I'm like schedule oriented. I feel like I'm not sort of artistic and creative and haphazard. I'm very much more sort of by the book, one step after the other.
Yeah.
So for me to look at this, I'm not surprised, but it is sort of sad, right? Like, I want people who are in agreement with me politically to be able to get some relief from this existential angst, because apparently, liberals and leftists rank higher on anxiety, depression, all sorts of negative emotions, neuroticism, etc. So the first thing that came to mind when you told me this and when I looked at these charts is religious versus non-religious people. This is very similar to what we've seen previously when they've done studies on religious versus non-religious people. It turns out that, when somebody's in the hospital or on their deathbed or whatever, they're having a tremendous personal strife. Being religious actually helps massively. It makes people feel like there's something beyond this material world and they're comfortable and relaxed in knowing that everything's going to be okay. God has a plan or whatever. Whereas if you're non-religious, you almost feel like I'm kind of screwed here, right? Like I'm in this in my own. In this on my own, and like, what am I going to do? I would argue that also part of this is just realistic versus non-realistic. If you're somebody who is very attuned to the problems in the world today, about climate change, about corruption, about the lack of economic mobility, that can lead you to be more pessimistic because you're like, hey, I see the problems. They're real. What the hell are we going to do to fix this? It doesn't seem like the ball's moving in the right direction. So what the hell? That could bring about negative emotions. But what I would argue is I think that people on the left, on top of just like fighting to genuinely fix these problems, which is a given, right? We all need to do that. We also should get better at compartmentalization because I think conservatives might be better at that as well, which is like there's my public life, there's my private life. Like, there's different aspects to your life. And can you shut out all the world's problems when you're with your kids and you're reading them a bedtime story. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
and I think that people who are liberal or on the left, they're much more likely to just sort of let that existential angst crush them and not create little like safe havens for themselves from psychological angst. And it's work, right? Like you gotta, it's actually a process to get to that point. But I think people really should work on that because, I mean, this breaks my heart seeing the people who agree with me politically are basically all depressed, anxiety-ridden, dealing with all these like psychological issues. And go ahead.
The one that I'm looking at the ones where there's the biggest divide. And as I mentioned before, one of them is on the future often seems hopeless, which again, you look at climate, you look at the problems, like that one makes sense to me. The one that I find kind of the most distressing or saddest is on the question of I take a positive attitude toward myself because it's that one you can't say like there's these external factors and it makes, I mean, that's all just about how you're literally treating yourself, like what sort of grace you offer to yourself. And again, those numbers are on the rise, like disagreeing with like basically taking a negative attitude toward yourself. Those numbers are on the rise for conservatives and for liberals, but there's a large and growing gap between liberals and conservatives. And that's the one that of all of these really kind of maybe bothers me the most. Another one where there's a significant gap is life often seems meaningless. But in general, when you think about the external assessments, it does make some sense that people who are broadly on the left versus people who are broadly on the right, people on the left, the orientation is like, we need to change things. There's things we need to do. There's work we need to do. We're in favor of larger changes versus smaller changes. Whereas the conservative, like the core conservative attitude is like, things are pretty good. We can like tinker around the edges, but like, let's just kind of keep going in the same direction that we're going in more or less. So there's some logic in general to people on the left having a greater sense of dissatisfaction with the country, the future, the direction that we're going in. The personal traits here, negative traits, are harder for me to explain or wrap my head around.
Was this just the U.S. or was this international?
I think that this is just the U.S.
Okay, well, in the context of the U.S., who is the right-wing leader?
Trump.
Obviously, right? Who's the left-wing leader?
Biden.
No, I would argue there isn't even a left-wing leader, right? Like the right has their like guiding North Star, however massively flawed he is. The left doesn't have that, and I mean that might have something to do with it. The idea of like I have a negative view about myself, that is very sad to hear that people on the left are more likely to think poorly of themselves. But what I would say to those people is like you can't compare yourself to other people, which oftentimes gets people to that place.
Yes.
You need to compare yourself to you yesterday.
I also think that I do think this is where the generational piece comes back in. We have a lot of data about how young people are really suffering through a crisis of anxiety and depression, which was already ongoing and was really accelerated by the pandemic. We also have increasing research that ties a lot of that to social media and smartphone usage. When the numbers start to spike is 2012. That's when social media in its current form really sort of takes off, and the use of algorithms to keep people engaged and on the platform and incited and rageful and insecure and all of those things. So when that really takes off, it's also when smartphones reach a critical mass of pervasiveness in society. Now, I'm not saying that's 100% of what's going on, but I am increasingly convinced that that is some chunk of what's going on. And it ties in with what you were saying, Kyle, about like comparing yourself to others. If you're a spectator on Instagram looking at everybody else's like perfectly curated lives, that could contribute to this sense of inadequacy, this sense of like negative emotions about yourself. And there's even research about, because the way that girls and boys are online can be different. Boys tend to gravitate more towards gaming, which apparently has fewer negative psychological impacts because you're doing something, you're a team, you're oftentimes with your friends doing it together. Whereas if you're a girl, you're more likely to be like scrolling TikTok or Instagram, and that seems to have more negative health consequences. So I think that speaks to that, like not measuring up to how you feel like everybody else is doing.
I got good news for everybody, though. If they're worried about stuff like that, social media is literally like everybody is their own Kim Jong-un. They're doing North Korean level propaganda about my life is awesome. Tee-hee-hee-hee-hee. Look at me frolicking on the beach with my boyfriend. Tee-hee-hee. It's like, we all know you're miserable, Betty. Relax. You know what I'm saying? So like, that's good news for everybody who like is trying to measure up against other people. And
Yeah.
like don't worry. That's all fake. Anybody who goes down that path of like social media obsession, they are not happy. I can guarantee you that. Now, having said that, I do think it is a little overstated how much like, smartphones add to us, feeling shitty. I think there's a point there, but also at the same time, I think we sort of overlook the massive positive things that come about from having the internet available to us 24 hours a day, where we have like, all the knowledge that the world has ever garnered at our fingertips at any given moment.
Yeah.
So what I would say is this, to the idea that a lot more on the left think life often seems meaningless. I think the right has their, cookie cutter answers on like the meaning of life. It's like God, family, country, I'm done, Like, this is what we've been taught. This is what we know. It's God, family, country in that order, or maybe a slightly different order, but that's what it is, right? And so when you have that, what feels like a sense of objective meaning, you're going to rest a lot easier because you know what you have to do. Even if you don't measure up to the thing that you have to do, you have to do that, right? On the left, there's going to be more of a sense of it's subjective, right? Like, what is your reason for living? What's your meaning of life? And it's like, it's subjective. You can pick something. And when you can pick something, it's almost like paralysis by analysis because you have all the options in the world. And so people oftentimes settle on nothing. It's like the path of least resistance. They default to like, I'm just existing. And there is no actual meaning for them. And I think that that's a huge, huge issue because, ideally when a kid's young, you start them out in a whole bunch of different activities and see what they like, and then they get obsessed with it, and then they use that as a defining thing of their life. And if you're unfortunate enough to not have gone through that process and not have narrowed it down from 5 things to 1 thing or 2 things, then oftentimes you're just in no man's land. You're in this weird limbo where it's like you're existing, but you don't know why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
But look, that can be fixed. It's not easy, but it can be fixed. You have to actually try to pick up various things, whether it be hobbies, whether it be a profession, something you actually care about and you want to get up out of bed in the morning. And I just think that with people on the right, I think many on the right are more authoritarian by nature. And so it's like, what's the chain of command? Who am I listening to? Okay, it's my mom and my dad. Got it, right? And so then they have their answers. God, family, country, like, we'll work with it. And even throw, I said God, so religion is part of that. But with people on the left, it's a little more like it's open, right? What's your meaning? Well, it's subjective. Okay, but it's subjective, but you should pick something that objectively makes you feel like you have meaning and go down that path aggressively. And I think that doesn't happen a lot today. And so that leads to these devastating numbers that we see right here.
Yeah. Do you think there's also an element of kind of like ignorance is bliss? Like, if I don't believe in the climate
Absolutely.
crisis,
I mean, and
I'm just going to accept like God, heaven, whatever, like I'm just going to not think too hard about the way things are and the way things could be better. It's just like, it is what it is.
Yeah, and that's what we learned.
That is sort of psychologically comforting.
Yeah, and that's what we learned in the religious versus non-religious studies.
Yeah.
That there's a big element of that. So if you don't think too hard about it and you just think like, yeah, these are the answers I've been given, true enough, yeah, there's a sense of comfort in that. There's a sense of comfort in that.
Yeah.
So I think that it's paralysis of analysis. It's lack of any sense of objective meaning, and it's a shame. I would love to see people who are on the left and people who are liberals be just as happy as conservatives or happier. And it looks like it's the perfect storm where that's not happening. And it's also kind of sad as like a rallying cry to try to get people on your side.
Like,
come with us. We're
miserable with us.
It's terrible.
It's like, maybe I'll just continue not thinking about these problems. That seems nicer.
That's what a lot of people are doing.
Yeah.
I mean, we should fix the problems, but also I wish people could compartmentalize better and create meaning in their own lives better, but clearly they're struggling.
Yeah, in a sense, you gotta live in a moment. You have to be able to recognize like the very real problems that society faces, that the planet faces, that are really in our face right now with the wildfires and floods and extreme temperatures and whatever, but also be able to enjoy like the pleasures of life and the things that personally sort of like satisfy and fulfill you. And I understand that's not always easy.
Final point, I wonder how much those numbers would go up among liberals on the left if we had universal health care, if we had free college, if we got rid of the medical debt, if we got rid of the student loan debt, if we had higher wages, if we had stronger unions, if we ended the wars, if we did a massive investment bigger than what we got in the IRA to try to get off of fossil fuels and towards
I think it'd be huge.
You think that would change those numbers significantly?
I do, because some of the other studies I've seen about, factors in people's lives that contribute to personal happiness is how much control you feel like you have over your day. And so if you're in debt and you're having to work two jobs that you hate and make you miserable, and you're sort of like up against the wall every day, you're going to feel like you don't have a lot of control over what you're doing day to day, hour to hour. And so if you had a reasonable floor under people where they felt that, relief and the ability to evaluate their options, the flexibility to pursue something that they may really enjoy, the way that, we're so fortunate to be able to work in a field that we actually care about and get fulfillment out of. Yeah, I think that would be a game changer. Absolutely.
So in other words, you think, you don't think there's an element of, it's sort of in the nature of a liberal?
I mean, I think there's an element of that. But you have to explain why the numbers are diverging so sharply right now.
Right. I'm saying some people would make the argument that it's just in the nature of a liberal, that they are just more anxious, they are just more neurotic, they are just more depressive. That's what some people, I'm not saying I necessarily agree with that. I'm just saying some people make that argument that it's a priori the case.
I mean, I actually do think there's an element of that. I wouldn't describe it as like more neurotic. I would describe it as, if you're a liberal and you are more comfortable with and more desirable of big change, then you're obviously going to see bigger problems in the system as it exists. Whereas if you're a conservative and you're sort of like, yeah, things are good, let's just like tweak it maybe a little bit, but let's basically keep things going, then you're going to be more satisfied with the state of affairs as they exist.
I understand what you're saying, but that's I don't think that's an a priori thing. You're saying they're analyzing it and then feeling that way. Where the point some people make is, even if we got all the things that liberals wanted, the numbers would still be like this, because that's just how they are. Genetically, basically.
Genetically. Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a very complex conversation, but either way, I feel bad. That's
Feel better, guys.
Guys,
hang in there.
Get happier, please. Yeah. All right. Now, having said all that, allow me to introduce Zach and Gavin of the Vanguard. Let's kick it off. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.